Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We hope that you, your families, and communities are staying healthy and safe and taking care of each other during this time. We're going to begin with a land acknowledgement. So as a step towards honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral, stolen, and unceded territory of the Native people where you're joining us from, and you can do that in the chat. I am participating from Chicago, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also call this area home. This region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of the city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals and communities who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black lives matter. We commit to move beyond words and into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. We're so excited to have you be part of our last webinar of this 2021 National Webinar Series. This webinar is titled Critical Consciousness for Community Engaged Teaching and Learning with our presenters, whom I will be introducing shortly. First, I want to make a few announcements about what's upcoming for Campus Compact programming. So those of you who may be on our mailing list, we sent out, I believe yesterday or early today, our Compact in Action newsletter and some of the things that you might want to pay attention to. Tomorrow, we are having an event titled Holding Space for Discussion of the Chauvin Verdict. This space is here to help us reflect and find individual and collective strength we need as a community and a network looking towards love and healing. And so I will put registration for that in the chat if folks are interested in participating. That is tomorrow, Friday at 3 p.m. from 3 p.m. to 4:30 Eastern. Also, if you are a Campus Compact member, we're hosting open houses, so you can find out more about Campus Compact program. You can invite members from your institution to find out about the resources available through Campus Compact. And our next open house will be Monday, April 26th, and I'll also put a link to register for that open house in the chat. And we are also in need and looking for co-facilitators for our Summer 21 Community of Practice. I'll put a link in the chat where if folks are interested in applying to be a facilitator of the Communities of Practice, you can do that. Some of the folks on our webinar today have been, and this work came out of a Community of Practice. So we're excited to be able to offer that opportunity again. And then lastly, as a closeout, we are open for accepting proposals for next year's National Webinar Series. And so if you have a body of work that you're interested in sharing with the larger Compact community, please consider applying and submitting a proposal. Proposals will be due on May 21st, and I'll also put a link in the chat for that. So now let me introduce our presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Leah Baker. She is a culturally responsive educator who has built a strong record of connecting theory, research, and practice in multiple settings. Dr. Baker's scholarship focuses on critical pedagogy, multicultural education, and critical race theory through an array of independent collaborative research projects in local, state, national, and international forums. Connections across teaching, service, and scholarship have resulted in written publications and presentations that reflect value-added themes of cultural competence and social cultural learning. Dr. Baker facilitates critical thinking in communities of practice and advocates for research and scholarship that fosters a commitment to social justice. She is also a member of our Engaged Scholars Initiative, our Midwest cohort from 2020, and a co-facilitator with me and a couple of others in our anti-racism community of practice. Next, I'd like to introduce Amy Garrigan, who serves as the Community Engagement Specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. She's been in this position since 2017. In her role at Parkside, Garrigan coordinates community-based learning opportunities that connect faculty and students to community organizations in order to deepen students' learning and help meet community needs. She also teaches the foundational course to the Community Engagement Certificate, CBL 101, Introduction to Community Engagement. Before coming to Parkside, she worked for over 8 years at Kenosha Unified School District, first as a service learning facilitator, and then as a professional development specialist. In 2010, she won the Governor's Service Recognition for her work with Kenosha Unified Service Learning Program. Her professional experience also includes work at Lake Forest College and Pacific Lutheran University. Garrigan earned her BA in biology from DePaul University and her master's degree in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Washington, Tacoma. Next, I'd like to introduce Christina Kofoot, CPN, who serves as the Community Engagement Program Coordinator at the University of Northern Iowa, as well as an advisor for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance Student Association. In her role at UNI, Christina works with faculty, staff, students in helping them connect to the community and with the community in connecting to campus. As an advisor for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance program, Christina works with students who are interested in earning their certified nonprofit professional credential, CPN, and working in nonprofit sector upon their graduation. Christina is passionate about creating and supporting mutually beneficial campus community partnerships and ensuring that students are able to succeed on campus and in the community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
One more, we've got Dr. Tannen Brecky is the Director of Community Engagement and Service Learning at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is responsible for directing place-based partnerships between Bethel and Frogtown and Summit University neighborhoods in St. Paul, Minnesota. He also teaches courses on community engagement, social justice, critical consciousness, and whiteness. He has a doctorate in higher education leadership. His dissertation was titled Exploring Opportunities on Liberal Arts Campus to Develop Students' Critical Consciousness, a Qualitative Study. Tandon lives in North Minneapolis with his 4 kids, Eva, Rayleigh, Anika, Micah, and his wife of 20 years, Erin. So here are our wonderful presenters. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marisol. I'm sorry, Tandon. We worked so much together. I just assumed we had already come together in this space with our welcomes and introductions. Welcome. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be in this space. I think it's a good time to perhaps to share a poll. We'd like to know who's in the space, who's joining us today. So if you wouldn't mind, Marisol, on your end, we'd love to see who's with us. So on the screen, if you'll just share in the quick poll, we're asking to let us know who do we have in the space today, which choice closest aligns to your current role in higher ed or in the community. Is it higher ed faculty, higher ed student services or student affairs, student engagement or outreach, community-based organization, administrator or other, any of the like. So go ahead and participate in that poll for us. Wonderful, beautiful. That's awesome to see so many community engaged folks from student outreach and service learning. It's also wonderful to see so many faculty and student affairs. That's exciting. Well, welcome everyone. This webinar grew out of a campus compact community of practice entitled Developing Students' Critical Consciousness Through Meaningful Praxis and Community Engagement. During this community of practice, the facilitators and the participants alike found the need to continue this ever increasingly important dialogue and consider ways to further enhance, develop, and theorize critical consciousness and community engaged teaching and learning, and for working with and within communities. If we can go on to the second slide, Amy. Thank you. We, as a community of practice, made a deliberate attempt to allow the theoretical underpinnings of critical consciousness to help sort of keep us on our toes in defining critical consciousness as it has been articulated in current and relevant research, in current events, in describing ways to engage others in their own safe exploration of critical reflection. So we utilize these goals to help guide us through our work, our collaborations together. We really wanted to provide explicit examples of when theory informs practice and has the ability to intervene in order to change outcomes. And we situate that, and we function within definition and cultivation of critical consciousness. And those outcomes then become moments where we can transform and empower individuals by transforming and empowering ourselves as well. Let's go into the next slide. So thank you very much, Dr. Marisol Morales, for introducing all of us. So we'll go ahead and just kind of give a quick synopsis of who we are again. I am Dr. Leah Baker. I'm an associate professor in the College of Graduate Studies at Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What drew me to this community of practice was the opportunity to connect with others in a collaborative learning space aimed at cultivating a stronger commitment and connection to critical consciousness development that works to disrupt habits of mind that perpetuate social isms and injustice. So stop there.
And my name again is Amy Garrigan, and I work at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. And I came to the community of practice in part because I've had great experiences in previous communities of practice offered through Campus Compact. So I really value these opportunities to talk to colleagues from across the region about some of the shared work that we do. And in particular, this community of practice was of interest to me because I was looking for sort of ideas and in ways to enhance my own practice as an instructor in the classroom, because I wasn't happy with the level of critical reflection that I was getting from students in our community engagement course. And then also to look for ideas to, again, continue that professional development for faculty who we work with who are teaching our community-based learning courses.
And I'm Dr. Tannen Brecky from Bethel University. I'm Assistant Director for Service Learning and Community Engagement. And what drew me to this community of practice was in the fall of 2019. I was just wrapping up my dissertation on critical consciousness, and I was really eager to jump into a group to explore these ideas, think about how they applied in my professional context, but then also in my personal life. And that's exactly what I found in this beautiful group.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christina Kofod at the University of Northern Iowa, and I was really drawn to this community of practice, not only to look at my own reflections on critical consciousness, but to look at how to effectively work with students around their critical consciousness and connecting their classroom work, their internships with deeper reflection, and so that they could take their educational experiences into their future careers in the nonprofit sector.
So the goals of the Campus Compact Community of Practice is situated really well for conversations to occur that we were having individually, and then we came together collectively to share and build and grow. Those conversations occurred right at the crux of our roles, as faculty, staff, members within communities, and also as our work sort of converges within institutions of higher ed. The collection of teaching and research experiences supported the development of the relationships, the partnerships, the collaboration. We really tried to center a democratic participation in this community of practice, which was just phenomenal. We all came with a commitment to addressing critical issues. We all wanted to do something different, particularly as it related to higher education and to achieving equity in order to position ourselves better within our roles, within institutions of higher ed, to be able to improve outcomes and the opportunities for our students. So during this time, we were occupied with critical issues, and we occupied a space for those critical issues to emerge, for concern for those critical issues, and we developed a praxis around demonstrating how we might grow in our own practice as a result of putting critical issues at the core of our praxis. So if we want to go to the next slide. So the first step in cultivating this space that we're describing was to allow for the sharing of readings to help ground us in our definition of critical consciousness that would allow for us to operationalize the goals of social justice and change. Let's continue to the next slide. Critical consciousness is having knowledge of the past to help inform decision-making for the future. That decision-making that will result in the gradual undoing of oppression. Critical consciousness is having the knowledge of the fact that perception of reality and experiences alike is a certain kind of possession. And so we operationalized the foundational core, the foundational definition that Paulo Freire, a Brazilian philosopher, operated within, that helped us to understand that actions are rooted in a perception or depth of knowledge that oftentimes need to sort of be brought out, if you will, in order to inform better decision-making moving forward. Next slide. So as a community of practice and a community of practitioners and scholars, we spent a great deal of time reflecting on social issues as a whole, followed by deep reflection prior to determining these steps. Action steps, if you will. We began sort of at the onset of a national pandemic crisis. In the United States, we found ourselves committed even more to dialogue and supporting one another towards the goals that we had initiated, the goals that we had initially set out to do in the face of dealing with a global pandemic. We found ourselves committed to the dialogue to support one another. Toward the end of the COP, we were all faced with unimaginable challenges due to the impact of COVID-19. So that was important for us to situate our work in real time. Our work and our time together as a COP became even more important as we witnessed structural and systemic injustices as a nation, as a field, in our practice, and we felt the need to do more than we were doing before. Okay, if you can continue on. I'll just kind of share a little bit about my work and how that began to sort of inform the practice of critical consciousness. And so as Dr. Morales shared with us before, in my work as an engaged scholar, I am committed to addressing issues in education at large and achieving equity in order to better position institutions of higher ed to be able to improve outcomes and opportunities, right? I wish to further this institutional commitment that bridges the purpose and the frameworks of this thought and this action. So we all want our students and our children to do this as well. We want them to know how to do this. We see the importance of teaching it. We see the importance of learning it ourselves. We see the importance of doing this because we won't be here forever. And we feel it is our legacy as a nation, given the critical reflection of the nation's history, that in order to change systems of oppression, we have to think very differently and use critical reflection and empowerment both as method and as habit of mind. And so Freire's work focused on empower. Oh, if we can just go back for a second to the last slide. There we go. Freire's work focused on empowering individuals to be agents of social change. Institutions are now strongly urged to explore this, to explore the frameworks and practices that empower rather than exclude, that empower and include rather than marginalize or disenfranchise. And so we became committed to really naming, framing, and addressing what it means to have a racially biased mind, to operate from a prejudiced perspective, to have fear around the ways that we operate within and with systems that disenfranchise human beings in some way, shape, or form. So institutions are now becoming more and more critically aware of that, I believe. We believe as this community of practice, we were well positioned to have those conversations in the midst of that disheartening reality that systems of oppression were really operating at large in that moment in time, in the present day and age, in current events. And so I myself, again, as a community engaged scholar, I began to be even more critical about the ways that we were operating within institutions of higher ed. It was really important to understand that from a theoretical perspective. Thank you, Amy, if we can go on to the next one. So what does that mean and what does that look like, and how did we continue to develop that idea of critical consciousness with regard for our own teaching and learning? So counter storytelling took on a unique disposition in our work and in our collaboration. Counter storytelling helps to break down barriers of hegemony rooted in racism, cultural dominance, and colonialism. So this group found a really great deal of value in giving space, holding space to the theories and examples of traditions of storytelling to improve our own practice in the ways we would engage with our students and to scaffold the learning. So teaching and learning were reciprocal processes. Sandon?
Yeah, so for us, it wasn't just talking about storytelling, but it was practicing it. So at the beginning of each of our gatherings, we would start by sharing stories about how the ideas that we were engaging with or the readings that we were engaging with were impacting the ways that we were thinking and enacting in our professional lives and in our personal lives. So these storytelling processes helped us build community with one another, trust, connection among each other. They helped us think about how our theory and practice were intersecting. And then they also really helped us problematize critical consciousness. And out of these stories, questions would emerge for us that would then help guide our times together and would really shape most of our conversations and our engagements.
Let's go on to the next slide.
So throughout our conversations, we all had different examples of critical consciousness. And we, as we consider critical consciousness, it's important to think about how we are raising our youth to become conscious of our world. Kids come into the world as critically conscious beings, and we start shutting this down by not answering questions and reprimanding creativity. A child who's reprimanded for drawing on the wall can't understand that their creativity isn't in question. They just know that they got in trouble for having fun. Kids can see and ask why, and it's our duty to keep those doors open. It's okay for us to not have the answer and to sit in wonder at questions. So as we work with youth and young adults in their college experiences, we want to go beyond the school for the job, the education for a job, and back to a space of critical thinking and consciousness.
So specifically, as we thought about critical consciousness and community engagement, these three ideas emerged through our time together. The first one is thinking about a place-based community engagement. And place-based community engagement is where universities develop partnerships with specific geographic locations. And one of the things that these place-based approaches can do is create the long-term partnerships, long-term relationships between universities and community partners. Versus more short-term partnerships, right? That you're here today and you're gone tomorrow. But these place-based approaches, you're in the thick of it, and you're in the thick of it for a long time. And that those deeper, longer relationships are particularly helpful for predominantly white institutions, because through those relationships, predominantly white institutions can start to ask much deeper questions about who they are and what their relationships to systems of oppression are, right? So predominant white institutions have the capacity through these long-term relationships, or have the opportunity through these long-term relationships, start asking the questions about what's their relationship to white supremacy, right? How have they benefited financially from white supremacy? Questions start to emerge about how do the young people in these communities of color that we're partnering with, how do they, when they come to our university, what's the campus climate like for those students? Questions emerge around the vendors of the predominantly white institutions. How many of those vendors are BIPOC owned vendors, right? And all kinds of other questions start to emerge because of these longer term relationships that help get at these issues of critical consciousness. We also talked a lot about partnering with community members as co-educators. So Miranda Fricker writes about epistemic injustice, right? This idea where certain ways of knowing are undervalued, marginalized, or sometimes outright attacked. And we talked a lot about how the universities typically are viewed as these sources of knowledge, right? And then they pour that knowledge into these empty vessels of that are the communities that they're partnering with. And critical consciousness challenges this way of knowing, right? And instead, it starts to see, it nurtures relationships that sees community partners having their own forms of knowledge and their own ways of knowing, and not only valuing those ways of knowing, but then also learning from those communities, right? So we talked a lot about how if we're really going to see community partners as co-educators, we're going to give them financial compensation, right? Adequate financial compensation for being those community partners, because we value that knowledge, right? Or there's going to be significant classroom time given over to those community partners, or they're going to be brought in at the beginning of projects or the beginning of research, because they're going to help deeply shape those projects or that research because of their knowledge. They're deeply valued. The other thing that we talked about was developing truly mutually beneficial relationships. Offers the institution ways of being decolonized, ways of viewing itself, or not viewing, but ways of operating that are new ways of operating, right? New ways of being in our society. But Freire warns or gives this analogy that decolonization is like childbirth. And he says it's like a painful childbirth at that. And here's a quote from Freire. He says, "Labor brings into the world this new being, no longer oppressor nor oppressed, but human in the process of achieving freedom." And then Freire goes on to add to this. He says, but even when the contradiction is resolved authentically by a new situation established by the liberated liberators or laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. On the contrary, they generally consider themselves to be oppressed, right? So this work of decolonization is a gift, but it's not often received as a gift by predominantly white institutions. So it is a gift, and those of us who are doing this work need to anticipate that resistance, and then also have the capacities to push through that resistance to see this decolonization actually manifest.
Another thing to consider when thinking about critical consciousness in our teaching and learning is effects on students in various ways. And one of those is the economic effect. We need to take into account what we are asking our students when we're sending them out into the community for internships and partnerships. There's an unfair economic impact in asking our students to complete internships that are unpaid, and these can lead to issues of equity in the classroom, as well as unbalanced students' abilities to remain critically conscious of their experiences. Rather, these students are spending time thinking about their second and or third jobs or taking on less meaningful but paid internships experiences. So one of the things we can do as educators and faculty and staff on our campuses is consider offering scholarships to our students that can help provide that economic support.
And to concur with Christina and some of her ideas, we talked as a group a lot about, so how is this tied to budgeting on our campuses? And how can we be more intentional about bringing some of these issues forward so that they become items that are discussed when those budgeting decisions are made? Okay, so like the purchasing decisions that Tandon spoke about, the ability to compensate our community partners. So what are the existing rules? And maybe your institution has a lot of rules or regulations that we have to follow when making purchases or doing compensation, but how can we both maybe gently push back at some of those so that they're framed in a different way? And how can we work within the system that we have to find those ways where we truly partner in an economic sense with our community? I also think too that as Christina spoke about the opportunities that students may have in terms of unpaid internships, I think, we started this community of practice back in 2019 pre-COVID, and now we have seen both the pros and the cons of this virtual world we live in, but how we can think differently too about equity and access for students who may not have transportation on campus, but can participate in community in virtual ways. And so how do we carry that, we think, mindful of that as we move forward so that we don't close those doors again in terms of equitable opportunities for students?
Regarding research, I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to conduct research that investigated educational experiences. And so similar to what Amy is talking about, when you think about the educational experiences of students of color in schools, there are these generative questions around the experience and the decision-making process. So some of the research that I've conducted in the past attempted to answer the question, what are the philosophies that Black parents operate within and identify as impacting success for their students? Where is the connection or the mismatch within school systems and homes? Is there a moment where we can utilize a critical race theoretical framework to help explore the issues and the concerns that African-American children face in traditional schools and analyze a process of revolutionary thinking? And so by doing that, looking at something like a Black homeschooling movement or Black homeschooling phenomenon really addresses the impact of the issues, the critical issues and the concerns that Black children face in our school systems. The questions that guide our research with regard for a theoretical analysis of what is happening can help to unpack and undo some of that oppression and injustice that has happened in the past, thus demonstrating a critical consciousness. And so asking questions like, to what extent do parents resist forms of hegemony in school systems that are espoused by a racialized society by way of opting out of the entire structure, by way of homeschooling as a method or a form of resistance? What can we learn from African-American parents who homeschool? What's their change agency involved in that? The data that we can gather from the voices of participants like African-American families who are homeschooling right now. What is the data suggesting? How does that particular data informs areas such as culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, inform our areas of student and family-centered educational practices? What are we doing wrong? What can we do better? Critical consciousness as empowerment and praxis can be informed by the data of collecting the stories and the voices of those who have been most marginalized and left out of a structure by way of our historical, racial, and social injustice. And therefore, we can increase academic achievement for students by way of tapping into the habits that have perpetuated injustice. Participants in those studies, in the studies that I've named, many of the scholars who have looked at education as empowerment, for example, education as culturally responsive, can collectively share and tell the story of race, for example, can collectively share and tell a story of the economics of the matter. And so there are many ways that critical consciousness can influence change as it connects with and directly relates to the social ties to education, education being one of the biggest social institutions in the United States.
I do want to take a moment also to recognize the fellow members of our community of practice who weren't able to join us here today on this panel, but certainly contributed so much to our understanding and the richness of the discussions that we had. So we have 14 people in the original group who offered a variety of perspectives. And in particular, it was very valuable to have 2 members of the community of practice who were working in community-based organizations. And so we do want to acknowledge that they really help shape our conversations to see the higher education and these community-based organizations not as separate entities, but the goal of being truly partners in this work together, and how much our community partners value their role as educators as well, and that they have so much expertise to bring to the table. So it was really nice to have that sort of all of those voices together in our community practice as we explore these issues.
Relating to what Amy was saying about having that community voice, we also talked a lot about how we, as at institutions of higher education, need to help spread the word of critical consciousness and help. I lost the word. Help decrease the fear of indoctrination as it relates to critical consciousness, especially in practice. An example of this was in the state of Iowa. This fall, legislation was introduced barring the teaching of the 1619 Project, which is a long-form journalism project developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, as well as writers from the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. And this project aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States. So this proposed legislation serves as an example of the need for education around critical consciousness and the fear that is out there of change and truth-telling. So if people aren't made aware of these inequities and we aren't taking action steps to constantly resist these oppressive norms and ways of being, then the result is residual inequity in perpetuity.
So another thing that we talked about in regards to specifically students, we talked about this idea of agency and social movements. Ferreri talks about moving from being passive objects that are acted upon in the world to active subjects that work with others to change oppressive systems. Right? So part of what we talked about was the need to help nurture students to move from being passive objects to becoming active subjects, right? And developing that potential within them. And seeing that the world is not just the way it is, but it was created and it can be recreated, right? It's not deterministic. So we talked a lot about how do we nurture those abilities within students and to embrace their own agency, and not to embrace it in like an individualistic way, but to embrace it as they collectively work with others to change the world around them. Go on to the next slide. closely connected to this idea around agency, we talked a lot about challenging dominant narratives. A lot what holds up these deterministic views of the world are the dominant narratives that give reason to and meaning to those current structures, right? So these dominant narratives become so ubiquitous that they're taken for granted, right? And they're often not challenged. They just become common sense. But critical consciousness starts to challenge those narratives through sharing of other narratives, right? And these different narratives help the students to start to understand that what they once assumed was just the way things are, they realize, no, it's not. Others see things very differently and experience the world in very different ways. And this quote is just one example that we wanted to highlight. That here, this white student says that as white people, we learn that the police are the good guys. I am now realizing that is not how all communities see the police, right? So through these narratives around policing, the student is starting to see, wow, what I assumed was just normal or natural or just the way it was for everyone, it's not true, right? And it starts to lead that student into a process of asking much deeper questions.
In many ways, these discussions we had, in the fall of 2019, the spring of 2020, it seemed so long ago. However, they were before some of the critical incidents occurred in our nation, the killing of George Floyd, before the civil unrest in our, in cities, in our own cities, and the unrest that continues today, before the shooting of Jacob Blade in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so we were in it, in the moment where we were ready and willing to take on these questions, this notion of doing something better by way of practice. And we began by saying we were in it for the long term. We were pretty shocked to find ourselves in the middle of talking about issues and incidents that were quite emotional, quite social, impeded upon our ability to be spiritually connected, to be philosophically present. And we were shocked into this work, and we can see easily how we can get lulled away from it, how you can get pulled out of it by way of some of those psychosocial, emotional impacts on our psyche. And so, how do we help our students understand that there will be accountability, that we need to continue the work, and we can engage in the work by way of doing it collaboratively, with reciprocity, and developing something better for the future. And so if we take a moment to teach our students to develop that critical consciousness framework, even just starting with the critical reflection that needs to happen on historical past injustices, and understanding our role in that as agents, we can influence social, political, economic systems to adapt to systems of liberation by way of us doing the work. Systems don't change without change agents. People are in the middle of systems, and we learned that together as we grew and as we explored really critical issues. A change agent is one who operates within a system to transform policies and practice, right? It doesn't always happen overnight. We're in it, we're right in the middle of it, but there's a lot to be done and said with regard for our individual change agency. Change agency is not without courage. It's not without sacrifice. It's not without misunderstanding. It's not without hurdles and stumbling over things that just don't appear to be going the right way. But if people are educated around freeing systems of oppressive behaviors and policies, we came to the conclusion that the systems we think are the most difficult to change can change almost instantaneously. So then, we ask, who's really in need of liberating? Is it, those who we deemed have been oppressed or have been marginalized, or is it those who continue to perpetuate systems of oppression? Considering where we've come from, you know, it's important to acknowledge the thought that grows out of people who have been marginalized, the intelligence, the critical thinking. You know, when one's mind is suppressed, it begins to create ways to escape that oppression, to escape that suppression. And we have really wonderful words for that in our culture. You know, we have healthy ways of doing this, which we tend to call grit or perseverance or talent, resilience, social justice leadership. All of that equates to transformation. I would certainly have to take or retake a course in psychology to be able to explain that a little bit more. But all the while, you know, we have the stories of resilience, the narratives of experience that help us understand why someone who has lived an experience of social and economic deprivation makes a great mentor, makes a great scholar, makes a great business mogul. Why cultural pride is an example of how we reclaim our narratives and reject oppression. It is the moment when one's identity gets reclaimed as a personal narrative and begins to reshape our habits. And we feel very strongly that we can teach our students this by practicing critical reflection in everything that we do.
As we're doing this work, we also need to share with our students that we are continuing to learn and implement as well. If we don't show that our students that we are doing this work in this moment, we can't and won't get by in teaching this. Bell Hook refers to this as the confessional narrative.
In looking at our takeaways, we wanted to offer a slide that really kind of summed that up for everyone. And so, you know, it really becomes a moment where we understood that community engagement isn't an act, it's a way of being in community. We also understood that we must be intentional. It is hard but necessary to carve out time out of our very busy schedules right now to do that work, but it's important work. And it's the work of bringing equity to the center of what we do. We also need to begin with the critical reflection, critical self-reflection in our own work, in our institutions, and a historical examination of racial and social injustice is powerful, right? It's an examination of the powers that leads to transformation. We began each session with exercises that centered ourselves as agents of change, and that centered around both our humanity as well as our humility.
And I also just wanted to add to that, you know, we talk about the ways to be strategic at the end, and sometimes that work of assessment and tracking data isn't always very exciting or glamorous work, but it's necessary to be able to define and track and assess what we're talking about, and so that we can actually see where there are some equity gaps and where we want to grow. And so we did talk about that as well, so that we can have that at the ready when we're asking for funding or asking for, you know, additional programming or staff, so that we can think about, well, this, you know, we can prove that we're making progress in these goals. And so we did put together in our group sort of our list of readings, videos, in different resources. And so we wanted to share that with all of you in hopes that you may find some of it useful. And as I said in the beginning, you know, that was sort of what brought me to the community of practice in the beginning. It was that idea of, I was really looking for some tangible things, some reading, some ways that I was going to improve my own practice. And I am so fortunate that I did receive that. But what I didn't know that I needed was the accountability of a group of people who we had a shared commitment to doing this work, to improving our own self-reflection and our practice. And so I highly encourage you, you know, if you know someone who's on this call with you, and you can reach out and say, hey, let's read one of these articles together and make a time on our calendar to talk about it, or you find some group on your campus or community. But I think we as a group, and I certainly say for myself, it was incredibly valuable to have that accountability and someone to kind of encourage and support and challenge me in the work. But we hope at least that this list of resources might be of help to you as well. So at this point, I know we do have some questions in the chat. So thank you all so much again for being with us and asking some questions. And I think we have some time to answer those, right, Marisol?
Yep, got about 10 minutes.
The first question I am seeing in here is there a way to find out if a vendor is BIPOC owned if they aren't registered federally that way? Are there curated lists elsewhere? Are there any institutions that ask this specifically of their vendors before contacting them?
That's a great question. I believe there are local municipalities. I wouldn't want to speak to, I know this is, nationally people do different things. I will say though, that oftentimes it is important to access some of the literature that comes out of community-based organizations. And sometimes those places highlight, Black owned or BIPOC owned organizations or businesses. And a lot of that literature can be helpful and supportive in that way. However, I think we might be onto something in saying that maybe this is a move toward action. Maybe that is something that we could utilize a bit more and implement. So I think that is an excellent question. Amy, were you going to?
I was going to just say the same. If it doesn't exist, if you're not aware of one, I think that's a fantastic opportunity to create one for your institution. On a very small level, I know that some of that came out of some of our community-based learning courses during the civil unrest that we had here in Kenosha. We had a group of students who actually did start creating a website of Black-owned businesses in the area because we didn't have that anywhere. So, sort of small steps, but I think it's something, yeah, absolutely a call to action that we could all contribute to.
One thing that we do is just getting into communities, right? And through relationships, you quickly find connections and opportunities to build on those connections. So another way of doing this is just getting out into communities and engaging with people.
Most cities, towns may have the registry for women and minority-owned businesses, but you can also do Google searches and put Black-owned businesses, and now they're starting to be tagged on some of the websites. And I think even Target has a list of the Black-owned businesses that they're participating with. So depending on what you're looking for, I'd say start with a Google search and see what you can get, but start someplace.
Our next question was, when you talk about community partners, do you also mean the community members or mostly the organization staff? While the community partner staff have a lot of knowledge and expertise, I think it's important to also be specific and center the knowledge of community members whom these organizations serve. It goes on to say it's rare that we actually are able to partner directly with community members' grassroots groups, yet community members are all present in the core of our work with partners.
I think that's an excellent question. It's a great question because it also situates the relational responsibility within, what the university does and what the community does and is bringing to that partnership. I will say that in my experience, I have seen really wonderful burgeoning examples of research practice partnerships in which we identify the partner as the person who is orchestrating or works to liaise the communication between the university as well as the community. And so even there's a moment of pause in looking at who's representing whom in those relationships. I believe there's a lot more opportunity for us to consider that, especially as we have done some not so brave, not so wonderful things in the history of our working with communities and community partners. And so it is an opportunity for us, I think, to challenge ourselves to be a bit more critically conscious and aware of the relational responsibility and who partners with who, where we find those partnerships, and how the institution highlights or acknowledges, recognizes who our community partners are. What is the role in again, reciprocity. What is the role in acknowledging and identifying who we work with? And I think that's it's a start of a conversation that needs to happen a bit more.
This is one of the reasons why my institution does not have an office for me at the institution, but I have an office in the neighborhood here in a small nonprofit organization, so that through being present, building relationships, I get to know more grassroots organizations and just community members, right, who aren't connected to any one organization, that there's more possibility for partnership to emerge. It's still a huge area of growth. I mean, that's still a challenge, because partnering with larger nonprofits in the neighborhood is oftentimes, quote unquote, easier. So.
Our next question was, are there any other community colleges in this webinar with highly selective admissions? Our campus does not take an applicant's identity other than their state residency in consideration for the program. I'm wondering if there are any peer institutions who actually do so. And that might be a question that could be answered in the chat. Please, if anyone else has any questions, we have time to answer another one or two. If you want to put them in the chat.
And I'd also love to hear responses, from people on the webinar. If you've had success with that last question of, how partnering with community members, not just organization, because I would say, again, that's probably an area that I know that I have a lot of room to grow. Our institution could benefit from any ideas. If anyone has success stories, thoughts, additional, please share in the chat. We can all learn collectively.
I will share that something our institution is doing with this is it's not working specifically with those grassroots, but partnering with our volunteer center. We have intentionally not created a position on our campus for individuals to find volunteer opportunities. Instead, we're working with organizations in our community that are offering these opportunities, because we don't want to be that institution who goes out and says, this is what we're going to do for you. We want that community input. But I do love that deeper questioning of, when we're working with them, are we working with the organization or the individuals being served, and how can we better serve those individuals as well?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, those were great questions. Absolutely great questions. I think there's one more maybe, Christina. I don't know if we have enough time for the other one or two.
Did they come up in the chat? Oh, they're in the chat. Okay. Elaine, to answer that, we actually pay our community partner, we work with the Volunteer Center of Cedar Valley. We have a contract with them. And so we pay them annually, and our office is advocating that we pay them more as our partnership has grown over the past 10 years. We definitely don't think we pay them enough. So we are in the process of advocating to pay them more, but yes. And there was a question about whether the webinar will be available. Marisol said, yes, it will be. Did I miss any other questions?
No, I don't think so. And in regards to the question about community colleges, my understanding is that community colleges function as the people's college, and they are about access. And so I have not seen examples of community colleges being having more kind of restrictive guidelines for entrance and those sorts of things. I think that goes against the purpose of why they were created. So thank you so much to our panelists and our attendees for participating today. This webinar will be available by the end of next week on our Campus Compact website. And if you registered for this and got access, you will be receiving an email with the link to access it. Again, thank you to our panelists, presenters, and attendees. And until next time, see you. Bye-bye.